Star Wars has never been a stranger to time travel, whether it's in the legends or canon continuities. The canon World Between Worlds may be one of the most familiar time travel methods to fans today, but in this video we're going to be talking about a time traveling Force technique which played a huge role in the later phases of Legends. We'll talk about how it was used, and most importantly, whether it meant you could actually change the past, and spoiler alert, the answer isn't super clear. We first get introduced to this technique called flow walking in the Darkness trilogy by Troy Denning, set about 35 years after the Battle of Yavin. Jacen Solo, the son of Han and Leia, had been on a 5-year Force training sabbatical after the conclusion of the hugely devastating Yuuzhan Vong War, and some of that training was with a group of monks called the Ang-Ti. These monks had a view of the Force as essentially a multifaceted rainbow, eschewing the Jedi's light and dark view, but most importantly they looked like weird lizards. They largely didn't engage in actually using the Force that much, but when they did, their abilities were focused on modifying space and time. For example, they could teleport themselves and other objects, just kind of popping them in and out of existence, and their form of hyperspace travel also relied on this. Their ships kind of just instantaneously jumped around the galaxy. One of their most interesting abilities, though, was flow walking. This technique allowed the user to travel into either the past or the future, witnessing events as they happened or would happen in a given location. So if you wanted to travel to the past or future somewhere, you had to be in that place. The rules on this aren't super strict or finicky. It's not like you had to be in the exact same place in the exact same orbit. If you were on Coruscant and you wanted to go back in time in the Jedi Council Chamber, you just had to be in the Jedi Council Chamber. Jacen Solo, on his path to becoming Darth Caedus in the Legacy of the Force books, often used this power to look in on the fall of his grandfather, Anakin Skywalker. Most importantly, he used this power to watch as Darth Vader attacked the younglings in the Jedi Temple. Looking into the past and future to help decide his course of action was something Jacen did regularly, and that played a large role in his own fall to the dark side and some calamities he unleashed on the galaxy. But the big question we're looking at today is whether this actually allowed you to change the past or the future. And I think it's noteworthy here in this quote that Jacen, when he thinks about changing the past, it's not that he stops himself because he can't do anything, it's that influencing the past would be going too far. And this conflicts a little bit with something we're going to hear him say later. One thing we can say with certainty is that the ability is not simply watching what had happened or would happen as a kind of movie. The technique specifically did transport you back or forward into a moment in time, experiencing and interacting with it live. But it's worth noting that, as Yoda says, the future is always in motion, although he said it in a slightly different order. This was something the Ang-Ti also believed, and that has important implications for this ability. You'd think it just has implications for going to the future, but it might also have some implications for how it worked going to the past, which we'll get to. When learning about this technique from an Ang-Ti monk named Tadar Ro in Fate of the Jedi Omen, Luke and Ben Skywalker are told, quote, "When you flow walk, things become solid beneath you. Your presence brings them into being, and yet once you depart, they return to what they were. What you see is a future, but not necessarily the future. It is real, and it is not, and it is." End quote. So essentially, the Ang-Ti saw the past and future as part of a kind of flow of the Force, a view shared by other Force sects like the Fallen Aussie monks who believed in the White Current. But there are things which could be done to impact this flow. And in some cases, we get some examples which make it seem like their belief about how much it could or couldn't be influenced is influenced in itself by their own philosophy, rather than on any actual practical limitations on the ability. The first instance we see of flow walking is in the novel Dark Nest: The Joiner King, which involves both impacting the past and future at least to some extent. Jacen Solo visits the site where a ship called the Tachyon Flyer had crashed. This ship was part of a mission he undertook with his siblings and other young Jedi Knights in the Yuuzhan Vong War, years before. The ship had been stolen by 2 Dark Jedi while Jacen's friend Raynar Thul had been aboard, and it had basically been their escape plan. I've done a video before on how this event became one of the most formative events in Star Wars Legends. But Jacen was able to step into the past while at the wreck, and he watched as Raynar and the pair of Dark Jedi escaped, several years after the event had already occurred. While doing this, Raynar sees Jacen and is about to say something when Jacen returns to the present. We know that Raynar saw Jacen and that this impacted that past event. Later in the book, Raynar mentions that he remembers Jacen being present at that moment as well. In the same visit to the same crash site, Jacen flow walks forward, also learning that his mother would be coming there, and he leaves a message for her on where she needs to go next. When Leia gets there, she experiences this as a kind of vision, seeing Jacen directly talking to her, as he did when he was there days before. This act in particular frustrated Luke, since Jacen in effect had taken the flow of the Force in the future and fixed it in a specific moment, one of the dangerous ways of interacting with time that we'll get to. But while we know that someone can have an impact on the past and future while flow walking, we don't know what the limit of this is, and we don't know whether that'll stop you from liking this video or subscribing for more. We do get some information which is, from a certain point of view, kind of conflicting on this. Once he's a Sith Lord, Jacen secures another Jedi named Tahiri Vela as his apprentice by promising her that she can flow walk back in time to see, and then maybe even save by implication, Anakin Solo, Jacen's brother, whom Tahiri had been in love with before Anakin died, on the same mission where the Tachyon flyer had been stolen. Jacen told Tahiri they needed to be careful because anything they do might have catastrophic effects, though his internal thoughts show that this is a lie he's telling her, and to his belief nothing they do can have significant consequences at least. She is able to make herself kiss Anakin one last time, something she withheld on the mission originally, saying he'd have to wait until he got back, which caused her anguish for years, since he did not in fact come back. But Jacen ultimately confessed that he had lied about their ability to impact the past. Tahiri was understandably not thrilled with this information, and she asked if the kiss had been real. Jacen's explanation boiled down to them impacting the memory of the event more than the event itself. That even though they could be seen and heard in the past, if they weren't careful, they couldn't change anything that would actually matter. So as Jacen explains it, the danger of being seen or heard in the past is that you might get hurt and then your own brain would essentially think you'd been hurt and it would cause a whole bunch of other problems. But especially given that a person who wasn't involved in the event could then flow walk back to where Tahiri had pushed herself into Anakin and would see the same modification of the same event, I don't think that Jacen's explanation holds water with what we know about the ability otherwise. It also doesn't necessarily match his own actions when he is flow walking or other things he says about it. So in this situation, I think we can just kind of chalk up this explanation as being more of a metaphor, while also being part of his attempts to manipulate Tahiri. Something we need to consider with a lot of this kind of thing is that characters don't always have a perfect understanding of everything they're doing, and sometimes they have motivations which make withholding information more important than giving the audience a strictly factual account of how certain abilities work. And sometimes their use can change as authors have different needs from or understandings of the same power. In the Legacy of the Force books, flow walking essentially stands in as the representation of a character's inability to give up certain attachments, and this goes on into the next series, Fate of the Jedi, as well. Tahiri's story in those novels is of someone who is living so fully in the past and commits horrible acts because she's constantly drawn back to the promise of Jacen being able to take her back to that moment, which might finally give her closure. But instead, it's part of Jacen making her live more and more in that moment. But when we do get to the Fate of the Jedi novels and learn more about flow walking from the Ang-T, we also learn more about the philosophy of the Ang-T. And here I think it's important to keep in mind that all the information Jacen had about the ability came from the Ang-T as well. And we get a bit more information about how these impacts on the past work. Quote, "That was one of the things that Tadar Roh had cautioned Ben about. One who traveled into the past could be seen and heard, even change things. But according to the Ang-T, the Force would resume its natural flow. One couldn't change things in any significant way. The Force would bring things back to the way they should be," end quote. So this portrayal fits more with what Jacen originally thinks about the impact of flow walking. Any major change you make would just get corrected over time. And that makes sense, given that he learned from the same person who explained it to Ben and Luke. So, for example, if they had managed to somehow save Anakin on the mission, maybe they'd save him in the fight he died in originally, but he might just die in a later fight on the same mission or just somewhere else down the line as well. And this same theme of not being able to give up the past is something that continues into the Fate of the Jedi books with Ben. Ben was originally desperate to learn flow walking because he was hoping he might be able to stop Jacen, and he flow walks back to a moment where Jacen, before he goes to the dark side, was talking to Tadar Roh, ultimately deciding that trying to warn Jacen away from his path towards being a Sith wouldn't get anywhere. Quote, "He knew that even if he had done so, even if he had been able to tell Jacen about all the atrocities he would eventually commit, it wouldn't have made a difference. The brokenness was already in Jacen. The progression from Jacen Solo to Darth Caedus was inevitable and unstoppable, and that knowing broke Ben Skywalker's heart, end quote. So it does seem as if you could shift things in some small way, but there's a line in how much that can happen. And as the metaphor of a pebble being thrown into the river, used by Jacen to describe their ability to impact things, says, the ripples would eventually go away and the course would be unaltered. But that still leaves an unclear limit on just how much things could be impacted. What if instead of going back in time to tell Jacen what he was going to become, Ben had gone back in time to stab Jacen? Even just within the text, we see Ben start to question how much of what he knows about the ability is actually true, and how much is just based on the Angti philosophy on how the Force works. If the Angti were wrong about the Force correcting this current over time, then what does that mean for the ability to impact the past or the future? Jacen was always very careful not to be perceived or to impact the past, for example, so he was working off his own personal experience as well as what the Angti said, but he never seemed to have made an attempt to actually change the past in any major way. Ben was mostly thinking about the ability to impact the future, but I think it applies just as much to the past. After all, if they're wrong about the current going in one direction, they might also be wrong about the current going in the other direction. Jacen may not have tried to change the past, but he certainly tried to change the future, and we see hugely negative consequences of that because he is successful, at least according to some of the characters in universe. Jacen's fall had been motivated by a vision, where he saw a dark figure sitting on a throne, and he believed he needed to stop that at all costs. He managed to do that, as Luke Skywalker in the same type of vision saw that man replaced with Jacen's daughter, Alana, which he was able to confirm to Jacen when he spoke to a sort of Force ghost of Jacen after his death. But this change in the current was believed by the Killiks to have been the act which freed Abeloth, the bringer of chaos. They believed that changes in the current of time and the current of the Force, which they saw as kind of one and the same, resulted in the freeing of Abeloth, which was necessary to correct the changes. This all gets kind of messy, but I think it ends up leaving the answer as slightly more unclear as to whether you can't change the past, or whether you can and there'll just be big consequences. If the current can be disrupted that much in one direction, who's to say how much it could be interrupted in the other? This is all why stories with time travel just get really weird. So ultimately, I don't have any especially conclusive answers to give you, but I hope you've enjoyed this look at time travel through flow walking in the expanded universe. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to the channel members and patrons who make this channel possible.